You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Land. This podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts Tiffany Cruikshank and Katya Bach as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. Hello and welcome, or welcome back to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. My guess is that everyone listening understands that yoga is much more than just a physical practice, that it is underpinned by a framework of philosophy that goes back many generations. But even if you're a yoga teacher who learned about that body of knowledge in teacher training, you may or may not have integrated it into your daily life beyond your yoga mat. Well, that's where the podcast takes us today, and here to guide us is returning guest, Dr. Diane Malaspina. You may remember that Diane has a BS in psychology, a master's in education, and a PhD in educational and developmental psychology. She's also a keen student and teacher of yoga philosophy and offers a couple of relevant online courses on the Yoga Medicine platform, Inside the Yoga Sutras, and exploring the yamas through meditation and practice. So let's talk about how yoga philosophy applies to modern daily life and hear about Diane's favorite yoga sutras. Hi, Diane. Welcome to the Yoga Medicine Podcast, and thank you for making time for us again.
Rachel, thank you for having me back. It's such a pleasure to be here with you again.
Yay. Well, we're here to talk about yoga philosophy, and that's something that I think, well, I know all yoga teachers are exposed to some extent in teacher training. And some teachers after that really dive in and then share it with their students, and others just don't. After teacher training, don't ever really circle back to it or think about it again. So I thought it might be interesting for me to talk to you. I know you're really interested in yoga philosophy, to kind of pick out a couple of nuggets that you think are really relevant to and applicable to daily modern life that don't require us to put our ascetic hat on.
Yeah. And first, I love to say, just like my disclaimer, is that I am not a scholar of this, but I am a psychologist, and I found the philosophy to be such a study of the mind, which is what drew me in. And I really love to share with both practitioners and students and teachers ways that they can integrate it into their practice, into their life, in order to maybe go deeper or explore another side of consciousness.
And you suggested that we start with a really quick sort of primer in case we have listeners that don't have that basic grounding in yoga philosophy. And I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. So the Yoga Sutras are one of the ancient texts that we often study in teacher training programs. And basically, there are 196 succinct lessons that are threaded together. So, sutra means thread in Sanskrit. And the idea is that we want to use them to form an understanding of the human condition, maybe our human potential, and how our spiritual potential can develop. So some people call it, refer to it as a plan for living. And it is within this text that the 8 limbs of yoga are identified. And many of us come to yoga through the 3rd limb, which is asana, the physical practice. And many of us explore pranayama, or the breath practices, as well in an asana or yoga class, which is the 5th limb. And basically, to put it into context, the sage Patanjali recorded the sutras in the early centuries of the Common Era. And it's basically, the gist of it is based on the kind of metaphysical, dualistic reality of what's called Purusha, or pure consciousness, and Prakriti, which is matter. And matter also includes the human mind. And so the premise, like much of Eastern philosophy, is that we all suffer to some extent. And in this particular text, it is really about how yoga not just the asana practice, but what's defined in this text as the eight limbs, really leads us to a sense of liberation from the suffering that we experience based on the activities of the mind. So, as a psychologist, that is really interesting to me because I
That's your
see
day
that.
job.
Yeah, it's also true in the modern world, right? So it transcends time in a sense, just like some of the texts in Buddhism and other spiritual practices.
I think that's a great foundation to start us off with. And I mean, this is not the entirety of yoga philosophy. There are lots of other aspects of yoga philosophy, including the Bhagavad Gita, but this is just one of those ancient and revered texts that you tend to dive into in teacher training. And as you were talking about Purusha and Prakriti, I was remembering a very long, very dozy afternoon with my philosophy teacher during teacher training where he spent a long time talking about their differences and their contrast and lost me completely. So rest assured, this podcast is about practical application. We're not going to dive super deep into the sort of esoteric side of it. So if you are having memories like that of your own, of diving into philosophical study and losing your way completely, this is about its modern and daily application.
Yeah, and I think it's coming full swing. I mean, I'm definitely seeing more things in terms of like the social media world on exploring consciousness in different ways, and it's having more of a quantum physics feel to it, right? And so those are becoming popular subjects in our modern time as well. So
Mm. Yeah.
it's
And one more thing I meant to say earlier is I was talking to my partner yesterday. He said, what's the podcast on tomorrow? So I was giving him a little overview and he was like, well, why suffering? And I think this is something that we kind of forget because I've had this conversation with 200-hour teacher trainees as well of in Eastern philosophy, it's pretty generally understood that life is uncomfortable and unpleasant, at least some of the time. And that is the nature of existence. And wouldn't it be nice if we could free ourselves from that suffering? Whereas I think in the West, we have the illusion that life is fun and enjoyable. It's like a sort of um, it's like a commercial on TV. It's all golden light and people laughing and dogs running in slow motion through the grass. That's how life should be. And when things happen that are unpleasant, that's an aberration. That's something's gone wrong with the matrix as opposed to this is how things should be. And I think that in itself is a really helpful starting point for appreciating yoga philosophy is that the nature of life is that unpleasant, uncomfortable, bad, unfair, unjust. Things are going to happen. That's part of the deal. And we don't have control over those, but we do have control over our responses to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I like how you point out that split between like what we think reality should be and what reality actually is. And I would add to that that um, many people may have that lens, that rose-colored glass lens of looking at life and looking at the journey through life. But at the same time, I also think, and as a psychologist, this is what I see is that we see these glossy magazine covers or images or commercials or shows where there's always a happy ending, and there's that split too within when people look at their own lives and think, well, why isn't my life that glossy or that
Yeah.
happy or this that I, feel these fluctuations, and is that normal? And, are the downtimes a sign that there's something seriously wrong with me? And does it mean I can pick myself back up?
Yeah, and I think that's a really helpful starting place to come from. Instead of thinking life is supposed to be amazing, it should be like the highlight page of Instagram at all times. And if that's not happening, then something's gone wrong. Just for me personally, everybody else is having a great time, but just for me, something's gone wrong. To the reality is, life is a bundle: good, bad, comfortable, uncomfortable, pleasant, unpleasant. And yeah, there's room for deeper reflection if you feel like your life is heading in directions that aren't fulfilling you. But the nature of life is to be up, down. And one of the really central teachings that I've found helpful from yoga philosophy is the acknowledgement that part of our job is to find some kind of equanimity, some way to keep ourselves centered while life fluctuates around us as it inevitably will.
Absolutely. And I really think if we kept track, if we were really good at, writing in our journals, or if we took in data on every day of our life, and we were to say, today was a really good day, and today was an absolutely miserable day. And then the rest of the days were like maybe just neutral, right? Neither
Mm-hmm.
great or awful. I think really most of our existence would be quite neutral if
Mm-hmm.
we really paid attention to it and collected data on it. And that's exactly it. And I think that that's really what this text is about, in a sense, is that we form these mental messages, and we get overwhelmed by these mental messages, a lot of it around what should be or what we think it should be, right? And that contributes to a lot of internal suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And as we get really basically tentacled to the trappings of the mind, what happens is that we lose our ability to find a sense of freedom as we live in the world. And so, um, the first place I think that we're going to start today is in the beginning of the text, which is in the first book, which has to do with understanding why we come into some sort of practices in life that help us with this suffering. And then the second tenet of committed practices, detaching from those committed practices, right? So I think of the analogy of showing up for an asana practice, right? So I'm talking a little bit about the sutras that have to do with the practices of abhyasa and vairagya. I think I wrote down, I don't have all the sutra numbers memorized, but Sutra
Yeah, I wrote them down
1.1
because I don't.
did. Yeah, 1.12 to 1.15.
Mm-hmm.
And really what I think of when I think of a yoga practice, and I think of like my own yoga practice now, 25 years strong, is remembering first practicing something that was more of like a vigorous vinyasa, or maybe even aspects of Ashtanga yoga, right? And feeling like I was striving towards something, and I was showing up all the time, and I was really working hard at accomplishing certain physical feats. And there was a consistency to it. I was like so in, I wanted it so bad. And I kept showing up day after day. I bought the unlimited path, right? And kept going. And so that part was the committed practice. But the part that I struggled with was the second part, which was called the vairagya, which was the detachment, or surrendering to the results, or not feeling attached to what the practice was bringing. And so I think that's probably common for anything that we're new at, right? Is like this vigor and this desire to like, do well, especially again using that Western mindset of like getting an A, or doing it perfectly, right? But um, I found some frustration in my practice during that time. And I also found some injury to my
Mm-hmm.
body during that time because of the inability to detach from that committed practice.
Yeah, and I think this is my favorite section of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. This is really, of the whole work of philosophy, this is the one that I potentially think about the most, because any endeavor in life that I can think of requires us to be able to find this balance between consistently showing up and doing the thing day after day after day after day, whether that is, getting healthy, or getting an education, or advancing in our career, or improving our finances, or improving our relationships, requires us to keep showing up and doing the thing, keep showing up and doing the thing, but leaving room for, I don't have control over the outcomes. I have partial control. I'm controlling the inputs, but I don't control everything else that happens in life. And so I have to loosen my grip on how I see the outcome progressing. Progress is very rarely straight line linear. Usually there are sideways steps and backward steps. Things don't go the way you thought they were going to go. Unexpected things come from left field that throw you off. So you have to have that loose grip to leave room for life to happen around whatever your pursuit is. And we make that sound really easy. Do the thing, don't worry about the outcome. But I mean, how do you keep showing up to do the thing when sometimes it goes really well and sometimes it goes the absolute opposite?
Love that. Yeah, and I think I love, so there's and I'll try to remember to mention this by the end of this pod, and then we can add it in the show notes, but I think there's a lot of renditions of the Yoga Sutras to explore, and one rendition that I really love is a less formal rendition by Rolf Gates called Meditations on the Mat, and he talks about abhyasa as the dedicated, unswerving application of what you believe in.
Mm,
And when you pose what you just posed about, like, how do I keep showing up in this way, right? I think part of it is that it's the mindset that we bring into what practice is to begin with. Like, is practice this 90-minute grueling physicality or is it, I remember the first time I was learning meditation, sit on your mat for 30 minutes and don't move, or something like that felt like it's like such a big thing to commit to. And it's like, well, how do we commit? Well, as a psychologist, when I'm helping somebody commit to something new, whether it be health or whether it be a spiritual endeavor or even a relationship endeavor, I take a goal and I break it down into like really tiny baby steps. And we do that with our teaching too. Like, what makes a great teacher is somebody who can break something down into steps to make a pose into a committed practice, right? Like, you could make anything a practice. So the first thing I think, and that's why I love that way that Rolf Gates describes it, is like having this sense of like, what is it you believe a practice is? Like, what are
mm,
you defining practice? Is it a moment of centeredness? Is it, 90 minutes of something very intense? And you don't have to judge. That's the detachment part. Neither one has to have like a judgment or a value assigned to it. But the tendency of the mind is to do that, right? The tendency of the mind is to think harder, better,
mm-hmm.
bigger, stronger, right? Or more. And we have this mentality of like more means quantitatively better. But I like the part where he also says this unswerving application of what you believe in. And so, like, for me now, being in this practice for many, many years, taking a moment to center my mind and breathing in the fresh air and maybe counting my breath a few times is as much of a meditation practice as the practice of when I forced my body to sit for 30 minutes in extreme discomfort, with a really active mind, right? Both practices. They're both a commitment to a practice. And so, like, you would think after many years of practice, we would be adding on and making it more. But in a sense, it's like making it somehow quantitatively less, but qualitatively more.
Yeah, and that requires
And that,
some real discernment, doesn't it? Because it requires you to see your assumptions. Oh, I'm thinking that, my goal of being healthy means I exercise 2 hours a day and I only eat vegetables. Oh, that's the yardstick I'm measuring myself against. That's actually not what makes me feel good. That's actually not what makes me healthy. So it requires you to see your assumptions and then be able to be much more deliberate about what that actually means to you, to set your assumptions or your beliefs or your misconceptions aside, the programming aside, and determine what actually meets that end for you. And for you, in terms of meditation, that is being mindful in daily life. And for me, that would be really similar when it comes to practice. It would be, I'm the kind of person who is mindful in my responses in life, or I am the kind of person who makes deliberate choices about how I take care of my body. So knowing your assumptions, seeing your assumptions, being much more deliberate about what actually does constitute the achievement of your goal versus what you might be programmed to think or what your subconscious is telling you. And that doesn't just happen. That really does require you to sit and reflect and to have a bad day and then go, why did that feel like such a failure? What yardstick was I judging myself against there? Oh, I was thinking that 90 minutes with sweat dripping off my nose was what constituted practice, but that's actually not what leaves me feeling like my mind and body are inhabiting the same place and the same time. Ah, I need to change my goal. I need to change what I'm perceiving as my tick in the box.
And that's what I think, that is the moment of detachment, right? I mean, that's that moment of letting go of like, I mean, in that, and we say this too in yoga medicine teacher trainings, and then a lot of us hear this throughout life: trust the process. And I really think that,
Mhm.
like, that's to me what these two tenets really bring to the table. It's like, trust the process is like, get in the process of it, like keep showing up to be in the process of whatever it is. It could be asana, it could be a mindfulness and meditative way of approaching life. It could be tuning in to who I am and what I need at any given point in time, at any given stage in life, right? And so I think that, and I mean, it's infinite what we could define what the practice is. And then I think the reason that these two go together so well and were taught together in the original text is because if you get the motivation and the energy behind that showing up for whatever it is that you're showing up for, then it's like, okay, well, how do I tweak this for it to be really meaningful in a sense? And that's through that reflection and detaching from it so it doesn't have to be something
Mhm.
other than us of what it is. And that's
Yeah.
what I love about it. And that's why I think to I don't know, I'm pretty sure you're similar to me. I'm talking about this yoga practice that started off in an asana sense is like really intense, and even in competition with myself, right? Over what it was going to be. And all of that had its value in the course of where I am today. But now my asana practice is way less amount of time, mostly much slower, and mostly about like really embodying things in a way that feel like it's like healing me, you know?
100%. And I think sometimes when it's difficult for us to reflect on our own behaviors, it can be helpful to take a step back and look at it from the outside. And I'm sure everybody listening has met someone or knows someone who sits too far on one end of that spectrum. They're the person who is so rigid about, you know, running marathons, whatever their thing is. I get up every day at this time. I run this many Ks. I'm tracking my times. I know exactly how many minutes per mile or minutes per kilometer. And, I've got all of my rituals built up around that. And if that goes poorly, that's the rest of my day completely ruined. I'm a monster to be with. I'm miserable. Nothing else matters until the next time when I'm testing myself and I've got X more miles or kilometers to do, or I'm trying to increase my pace by this percentage. And if that goes well, great. I'm happy. Life is good. We've all met people who are so attached to the process, like so in the process that it actually robs them of joy. It takes their freedom away. It binds them to that thing so tightly that there's no room to breathe. And I guess we've also met people who are on the other end, on the detachment side of the scale, where they're not willing to commit to anything. They don't, let anything penetrate their shield and make them care. They're not willing to set goals. They're just kind of drifting. And the key is to find the balance in the middle of what do I care about? What do I believe in, as Rolf Gate says, what kind of person am I? And how do I regularly show up to be that? But leave space for results to be what the results are, for life to intervene. leave space for, I imagined it this way, but it's actually going to come out a little different and maybe better. But if I hold so tightly, I don't give the thing room to breathe, and I don't give myself room to be human, and I don't give life space to happen.
Yeah, I love that. And what's standing out to me, the first thing, if I were to slow down and take what you just said to a deeper level, would be that um what we bring, like the energy, the attitude that we bring to something is that programming, right? That's like that prior conditioning that we bring into any endeavor. And so that alone can impact how we perform or how we show up, right?
Mm.
This idea of consistent practice. But then the thing that I think of again from the psychologist in me is, we live in this world that can be so results oriented, and what does that mean to you? Like how do we measure results? And secondly, how does it impact your mood? Are you happy by the fact that you get the chance to do, let's say, this race or this thing that you're preparing for? Or do you find yourself in some sort of negative state as a result of it? Right. And so then adding on another layer, and thinking about the detachment, like I kind of like how I kind of think of it as like a continuum in a sense of like two extremes, right? And I never really thought of it that way. But then the complete detachment without having the energy to step into practice, right? The complete surrender, right? And so then what is that? Like what's the patterning, what's the programming behind that? And what you're bringing to the table, right? And how do you, once again, like Rolf Gates says, is like tap into what is it that you want? And so many people are challenged by that. And so then looking at the middle ground of both of these two ends of complete detachment or completely like pushing ourselves to practice to the point of maybe breaking, um, where is the middle ground of like curiosity about the nuances?
Mm.
Is that place where I used to work with elite performers, and what you'll find with elite performers, whether they're in the business world, whether they're in an athletic endeavor, is that they're not hindered by their errors. They actually use errors as a system for feedback and for tweaking and fine tuning, right? And so, and what you see in like we're getting ready to have the Olympics, right? Those people who are going to perform in that Olympic arena for that whatever event it is that they're going to perform in, they'll have a couple of maybe rounds to get to the finals, but there's probably, no more than 4 rounds that get them to the finals. 4 events of performance, their whole life of practice, their whole life of practice, their whole life of detaching, tweaking, fine tuning to get to maybe 4 rounds, ultimately the final round, maybe winning a gold, right? And so the idea is that um, how can we detach from maybe the day-to-day outcomes and like drop into that deeper listening, or curiosity or refinement
Oh, I
along the
love that.
way? And
No, I
yeah,
do. I love the fact that when we find balance between the two ends of the spectrum, and I think Patanjali in some translations refers to it as the two wings of yoga, the two kind of balancing principles of yoga, that it creates space for not just pushing and striving and not just detaching and looking away or stepping away, but for details of technique, for nuance, for subtleties of sensation. And we talk about this on, I think, every single episode of the podcast we've ever had is a celebration of the power of curiosity. But there's no room for curiosity when you're strangling your goal with a tight grip. You have to have a loose grip in order to make space for What happens if I? How do I feel if I? What's different if? That the technique, the detail, the nuance, the subtlety, that's where you start to get more and more curious, I think, as you get deeper into a practice and more knowledgeable about it and skillful in it. The details start to become fascinating in themselves.
And when you're fascinated and when you're curious, you're usually in a more positive state,
Hmm.
right? You're not in that negativity of intensity towards yourself
Yeah, it's
or
not as single pointed as drive and determination. There's a spaciousness around, oh, isn't it interesting? When this, then this. Oh, when this, then this. There's inherently more room when you're curious than there is when you're just driven and single pointed and determined.
absolutely.
Mm,
And that's where then like you've now broadened, then and to me, that's the cool thing. I think that's the real gem in these sutras around consistent practice and detachment is that the gem is in the finding of like who knows. Well, leaving it open enough so that with the practice, it's the trust the process. It's like
mhm.
all of it. It's like, oh, now I get it, or now I feel it, or now I just know it. Whatever it may be,
Mm,
and it doesn't. And again, whatever that is doesn't have to be defined. That's the detachment part.
I love that. Yeah. So that was our first bundle of sutras that have obvious and really relatable application to daily life. We all have things that we want, we all have things that we're aiming for or striving for. We all have aspects of our lives that we see as a reflection of ourselves. Um, and so trying to balance that, doing the thing, showing up, doing the thing consistently over time without being too tightly attached to the outcomes, leaving space for curiosity. I think everyone can see applications of that somewhere, whether it's on their yoga mat or off their yoga mat. What was the next aspect of philosophy that you thought was really relevant to modern life?
Yeah, well, we talked about diving into the concept of ahimsa, which is one of the yamas. So, ahimsa is nonviolence, or oftentimes just considered a practice of compassion. And I think you said you wrote the sutras down. I thought I did too, but
Yeah, I had 229 talks about the eight rungs of yoga, the eight limbs of yoga. We go through the yamas in 230, and then we get into the details of ahimsa. I say the details, the sutra's tiny in 235, that when
yeah,
you are established in a practice of ahimsa, animosity is forsaken. And the details depend on the translation that you use. And that's part of the real interest of the sutras, isn't it? That they're so pithy that it can take scholars, years of study to pick apart all of the syllables of Sanskrit and look at how they balance each other and what alternate meanings they might have. But in the second
yeah.
book, anyway.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the thing is that when we I mean, and I think that was a good intro to it too, because it is pretty pithy. If you think about it, I mean, and again, if we bring it into modern life, if we think of the big picture of the world we live in today, I mean,
Mhm.
there's violence all around us,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you can't escape it. I literally just to kind of illustrate this, I opened up my news feed today, knowing that we were having this
There
conversation, and
was
the
your
first
first mistake.
first thing I did when I opened my news feed was there was an article that said the Surgeon General declares gun violence a public health crisis. Right. So, right there, like the first thing that's going to pop out is a message of violence. And obviously, we have wars happening globally. We have polarization happening, within countries, within
Mhm.
communities. And we also have factory farming, aggression against the climate, anti-LGBTQ plus and women's rights. We have racism. I mean, like the list goes on. Like you
Mm.
literally, you can find violence in so many different ways. And again, in this modern world, it's almost can feel like you can't escape from it. And so I'm going to sit here and talk to all of us about living in a world without violence, right? But I am, because there are a lot of harms that are associated with modern living. We also live in a culture that promotes burnout and chronic stress. We have a culture that's tethered to devices with less opportunity for engagement with nature and social connection.
Mm.
Sometimes in our wellness practices, we can feel tethered to, like we were just talking about, to getting it right all the time.
Mhm.
Uh, whether that's our personal care or how we care for others. And if we step back from all of this in the modern world, there's lots of anxiety, there's lots of fear, there's lots of shame and guilt. And so, how do we practice compassion in the face of it all? And the answer is one, understanding the context of ahimsa in this text. So, first of all, it's recommended that when we look at the yamas, the practices of how we engage with the world, that we practice them at the level of thought, word, and deed. So basically, it's the things we're thinking, the things that we're speaking, and the way that we're behaving in the world. And in one of the translations that I really love, it talks about violence is a reaction to fear, which is then a key symptom of egoism, which is kind of like being overly centered on the self, and a sense of ignorance that dominates our mind. And what I like to share with people when I'm teaching yoga teacher trainings or when I'm teaching yoga classes and I bring up the concept of ahimsa is that, yes, we live in a world where there's all these things going on, but we can also live in a world where when we start to face these really intense things and it brings up these negative feelings of shame and guilt and fear, and everything else, is that we can practice what psychologist Kristen Neff is an expert in, which is called self compassion.
Mm.
And it's kind of the idea, like, that Gandhi talks about, like, kind of the work starts with each of us, right? Like the change begins with us. And so when we think about, okay, well, I might not have control over all of these things that are happening in the world, but I do have control over what's happening within me. And so, based on Neff's work, it's the idea that having compassion for oneself is really no different than having compassion for others. And the word compassion, in and of itself, is derived from Latin, where calm means with, and passion means suffering. So, it's suffering with.
Mm.
So, self compassion involves what Neff calls doing a U turn and giving yourself the same compassion you'd naturally show a friend or a loved one who is struggling or feeling badly about themselves. And I like to, I again, as a psychologist, I'm working with people and I'm listening to their inner experience, and pretty much any session you start, someone's going to share a problem, and it might be a problem they're personally having or a problem they're having in this modern world
Mm.
of, this violence that's happening. And the thing is that is where we start to feel a sense of separateness. And so yoga is considered philosophically a practice of union, of bringing together, of coming together, and coming together of many things, kind of like what we just talked about of detachment and commitment, right? Of consciousness in the world of human mind and matter, and also that separation of those things that causes this suffering, as well as when we feel so separate in a world that doesn't seem to fit our needs. And so we start to learn how to be able to tend to ourselves by being kind to ourselves.
Yeah, I
And if
love
we
that.
were, oh, go ahead.
Well, I love that this is what you brought out, because on the face of it, it kind of sounds like almost like a cop out, like bypassing. The world is full of violence, but look after yourself. But it isn't. It really isn't, because firstly, if you circle back to the first bundle of sutras that we were talking about, I can't single-handedly, personally eradicate violence from the world. That's not possible. But that doesn't mean I shouldn't still show up every day and do the things, be in a committed, ongoing practice of compassion in my thoughts, my words, and my deeds. I can't be gripping tightly to eradication of all violence. That will only lead to my suffering and it won't improve the situation. But if I can show up and do the practice and have space around the outcomes, that's the only way I'm ever going to achieve anything in life. So there's the first part. And the second part is that it's trite, but it's true, that hurt people, that we strike out when we are scared or when we feel separate or when we feel threatened. And if we can feel safe within ourselves, emotionally safe within ourselves, we are so much more likely to have the room to notice how our words affect other people or how our deeds affect other people. We only really have that space when we're already being thoughtful with ourselves and are being generous and gentle with ourselves. That naturally leads on to us giving a little more room to other people to be people and to make mistakes. When there's rigidity around our own behavior, or when we feel less than or separate from or different to, that's where we tend to strike out. And so really, it's the only way we can approach compassion. It's starting from ourselves first and it radiating out from there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I agree. Like if we were to open the lid of everyone's, brain and get into what was being said in there, there's a lot of tough stuff. And we know that we're hardest on ourselves, right? We also know that we tend to stop caring for ourselves. And that's really what self-compassion is a practice of caring for ourselves. I mean, think about anytime we get overwhelmed or anytime there's like a major, even traumatic event in life, the first thing we give up is these, self-care things that we're trying to commit to. And so I look at this as not one more thing to do, but another layer of how we get out of separation and into connection.
Mm-hmm.
And so tool that Kristen Neff has developed, and we can also link her website because she offers this journaling exercise. And you can even just, once you get it down, you could just think about it. You don't always have to write about it. But it's about really accepting your humanness, because obviously, whatever it is, you're not the only person who's gone through it. I'm not the only person who's experiencing this big, violent world. Everybody's experiencing it. And I'm also not the only person who is experiencing what I think within myself is the thing that I'm the only person experiencing. Right. So, it's taking a moment to actually release the very things that you feel bad about, whether it's, you write about whether you've judged yourself for something that caused you pain, or you judged someone else, or you're aggravated, with a partner or a loved one. And for each event that you record, sharing, writing down or reflecting upon the feeling that's associated with it. Do you feel embarrassed? Do you feel shame? Do you feel not worthy? Right? Whatever it is that's coming up, again, as something that might be an act of unkindness toward yourself. And then using mindfulness to bring awareness to these painful emotions that are arising based on this self judgment or difficult circumstance. And then taking a moment to really broaden out beyond the self and writing down the ways in which your experience or the words that you're saying to yourself are connected to the larger human experience. And that could mean acknowledging, the state of being an imperfect human, right? And that all people have painful experiences. Or you could think about, the causes and the circumstances around the event as ways to see that there's like a humanity to whatever it is that you're experiencing. And then the last piece of it is giving yourself, as you would to someone else that you care about, some kind, understanding words of comfort, letting yourself know that you care about yourself and giving yourself that kind of gentle and reassuring tone. Like, it's okay. We all mess up. At the end of the day, this is one day in the scope of something larger, and humans across time and within your community and all around you are also experiencing difficulty and self-judgment and shame and all of these things. And it's in that finding that gentleness, it's in that attuning to yourself that softens the edge, that I really believe, just like what you were saying, is like now in the softer side of myself, I go back out into the world, and whether I'm a yoga teacher, a parent, a partner, a coworker, whatever the many roles that we take on, I show up without that edge, without that shield of what violence does to us.
I think that's beautiful because what you're really celebrating there is that compassion leads to connection, and that the more separate and isolated we feel, the worse we are to ourselves and the worse we are to others. Whereas when we acknowledge, when we create the perspective of, I'm not the only person through the history of time that has gone through this thing. Probably there's somebody not that far away from me who's feeling exactly the way I feel right now. Just that puts your experience into broader perspective. And just that softens your edges, as you said, so that you're feeling less separate and more connected to the human experience that we're all doing our best to make our way through. I think that's beautiful. And I think that in itself could become quite an in-depth practice.
Nothing to fix. Right? It's just allowing it. And then going back to, again, like what all, talking about your partner's question about suffering, like that's the thing, is like sometimes, we get into this, like everything needs to be tweaked and adjusted and manipulated and made better, and and into all of these things. And like, in that practice that I just shared with you, it's so eloquent, because it's not fixing something, it's changing kind of the energy of it, right? And allowing it, and allowing a human to be a human.
And to me, that's really similar to our first conversation, in that now there's room for curiosity and exploration, and there's room to examine the details, as opposed to it just being this thing that needs to be hacked or optimized or, eradicated, to being just another experience that there's color and texture and shade and pattern to, that we can look at a little bit more clearly and explore, as opposed to just this thing has got to be gone. This thing doesn't fit my life plan, or this thing is a failure. No, it doesn't need to be fixed or removed. It needs to be investigated and explored, learned from. Yeah.
Yeah, and that tool, like you mentioned, for connection, because if you think about it, many of the things that draw us in are the parts of life that are messy.
Hmm.
The parts when someone shares like something authentic of, like, oh, I was teaching this yoga class and I feel like I really, screwed up. More people are likely to kind of dial in and want to hear the story than when we are like, oh, I've been so perfect all the time. And, you know,
Yeah, which conversation would you rather have at a dinner party? I taught a class today and I was like, awesome. I gave myself a 10 out of 10, versus, oh my God, I did the stupidest thing today. Which one makes people lean in?
exactly, that leaning in and that vulnerability and all of those things that, I think are really important. And then just it also brings a sense of grace to how we treat ourselves. And, if you go back to, again, the theme of this book, it's like the whole busyness of the mind creates this suffering? Well, the mind is busier the more that the outside world gives us the type of stimuli that make it busy.
Hmm.
And if the busyness is related to those negative emotions that a violent world can bring, then we have to have some tool for transcending that, or maybe not transcending that, but really just like being able to be with it would be a better way of saying it.
Yes. The visual that I had given to me at some point in my yoga teacher training was the wheel. And imagine that you are the hub at the center of the spokes. The wheels are spinning around you. The wheel is going to keep spinning. That's what a wheel does. But the hub in the center is relatively still. It's equanimous. It's unchanged. And if you can find that capacity to be still while the events of the world whirl around you, that's the pathway to freedom. That's less suffering. That's less being pulled this way and this way, less high highs and low lows. It's just you're able to be with what is. The wheel won't stop, but you can be relatively still in the center of the wheel.
Yeah, and that's like, that's not easy, right? I mean,
Nope.
and then flip side, the other part of ahimsa that I think about too, is, yeah, like everything is moving, right? And then there's this sense of like finding that steadiness. And then there's this other aspect of ahimsa gone too far, right? Where it's like we have no boundaries, and we let everything just go, and we whether we people please, or we just allow people to like walk all over us, or whatever it may be, or we don't stand up for like, okay, I'm a recovering yes person, right? So for me, there was so much about feeling like I needed to be indispensable in some way. So I was showing up in so many ways in so many aspects of life, and that was harming myself, right? That wasn't giving me what I needed to recover and to like take care of my more fullest self. And so we need to be able to have a level of boundaries too, that and like a healthy no, right? Having the ability to be able to give and be with in community, and at the same time have the strength within to be able to say no, or to be able to have the priority on the self, in terms of like, the concept of like, I'm going to put on my air mask before I give somebody else's, is like, I am best to serve however I serve in the world when I'm stocked well.
100%. I mean, first and foremost, that allows you to keep giving. So it's much more sustainable over the long term. And secondly, when you're in that situation of trying to be all to everybody all the time, you're actually doing unkindness to other people. You're blocking other people's opportunities to step forward. And maybe you aren't the best person or the only person to serve that role. Maybe you're not even doing the very best possible job for the person who asked you in the first place. So by trying to bend over backwards and be so kind and so helpful, we're actually being unkind to ourselves, but also to the people around us.
That's a great point. I love that. Yeah. It's like using up everyone's resources, including your own.
100%. Well, I think that's as far as we're going to get in terms of Yoga Sutras most applicable for modern life today. Although, of course, we can always circle back for a part two at a later date. Anything else that you want to talk about in relation to the couple of topics that we covered today before we move on?
Well, I think we had a really fulfilling conversation. So
I
thank
enjoyed
you.
it. Hopefully, the people listening enjoyed it. I did want to
Yeah.
mention that you have a couple of courses on yoga medicine that people who are interested, people who kind of had their antennas prickling at this conversation might want to dive into. There's Inside the Yoga Sutras, which goes beyond just the few that we've mentioned today, the Path to Freedom online course. I'll link to that in the show notes. There's lecture, there's practice, there's journaling prompts, and that one does include continued hours of education, 3 hours of continued education. And there's also Exploring the Yamas through Meditation and Practice online course, which is a little bit more oriented toward personal practice. Anything you want to say about the courses for people who are like,
Yeah. The Inside the Yoga Sutras course is kind of like a book study. So if you grab your copy, you can kind of go through it with me. And I also created 2 physical practices, asana practices, just how I would theme them. And that might be some inspiration for you if you're teaching, to think about how you can weave some of the philosophy into your teaching. And then for the yamas class, exploring the yamas, that one, I get a lot of really nice feedback on, because it's kind of like a personal journey that includes some meditations, some breath work, some physical practices, a little bit more on the philosophy, and then some journaling prompts. So it's something that you could do as like a real self-study if you're interested in taking things a little bit deeper on a personal level. And of course, again, if you're a teacher, feel free to use any of those methods with the students that you work with. And I'd love to hear feedback, if how it's going along the way.
Brilliant. Well, we'll link to those 2 courses, as well as to all of your previous episodes on the podcast, for people who liked your style and want to hear you talk on some different topics, including the power of intention, drishti, the potency of our focus, and also finding ease in uncertainty, which is one of the biggest sources of suffering, I think, for the modern person. Is how do I find that dynamic equilibrium as the world whirls around me? And we'll also link to your website and your social media so that people who want to know more about you can find you pretty easily. Anything else you want to leave us with today?
Oh, I just want to express gratitude for having me back on. And it's just such a joy to talk with you and to share with this community. So it's a real honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you liked the show, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com. Check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine, or you can email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being part of our Yoga Medicine community. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.